Welcome back to part 2 of our conversation with designated drinker and director of education of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Latino, Emily Key. So if you've missed part 1, go ahead and belly up to the bar and give that one a listen first. We'll save a seat right here for you, won't we, Gina?
Yeah, we will.
All right.
Welcome back.
Welcome back.
Hi.
In last episode, we talked about a lot of the history of Cinco de Mayo, and Gina has decided she's gonna swear off tequila and nachos for Cinco de Mayo. Emily, I know there's a lot more here. Can we maybe jump into more current times and talk more about these damn French who left their lasting impression and actually made for amazing cuisine?
So I think one of the really interesting things is, as Gina was noting, a lot of the cuisine and the food and the culture and even the architecture has these influences of the French. And one of the interesting things about Cinco de Mayo and really the Battle of Puebla, the French incursion into Mexico, is not just the war itself and the history, which we talked a lot about and, I think is really interesting. It's the lasting legacy of the French, right? And when you think about Mexican culture and cuisine, there are certain things that are iconic to Mexico. You think of bolillos and sweet bread and pastry. And the interesting thing to note is bolillo, sweetbread, pastry, all these things that we think of as iconic Mexican dishes are actually inspired by French counterparts. So flan. How many of us love flan?
Oh,
I love it.
Serve it up by the bucket.
Flan is really just an old style French custard.
Yep.
With dulce de leche American, the America's twist, right? The dulce de leche that you would find in Mexico. It's really like the cousin to French custard.
So would they be kissing cousins then?
Yeah.
I mean,
French kissing cousins at that. Hello.
Exactly. So
Talk about your kink.
So one of the interesting things here is we think of very iconic things, and really it's interesting to look back into history and find out how they even showed up at our doorstep, right? So the Mexican bolillo, which is basically, it's a salty bread. Think of it as a football-shaped bread with a really textured, crisp crust, but then on the inside, it's very fluffy and just delicious to eat with like melted butter.
Everything. With all the things.
And it's like the size and shape of a small football, right? You think of this bread, and you think of it as this iconic bread for Mexican sandwiches. Tortas. They're known as tortas. They have lots of different meats, or sometimes they have chicken or cold cuts, cheeses,
beans.
Very iconic Mexican sandwich bread, if you think of it as sandwich bread. Not actually only Mexican. It's French influence. It's the Mexican version of a baguette. It is a smaller, rounder baguette, but it's influenced, it's inspired from the French baguette.
Also delicious with butter and ham.
And all the things.
And all the things. And actually,
and I'll put beans on that baguette too.
In today's day-to-day in Mexico, and for many Mexican-American communities in the U.S., if you go to the American Southwest, you have asked for a torta, and you can get it with, ham and cheese, your typical American sandwich, but on bolillo bread.
So let me ask you this then.
Which is okay with me.
So let me ask you this. So flour tortillas, is this from a European influence then? Because now all of a sudden I'm thinking a crepe is like a tortilla. Now I'm getting it's...
Funny you should mention crepes. Because I can go down the list here. So if you haven't been to Sanborns in Mexico City, must go to this restaurant.
I haven't been to Mexico City since I was a child because I always want to go to the beach and sit my not so brown butt on the sand.
You must go to this restaurant. And the reason why is there's an iconic Mexican dish called enchiladas suizas. Enchiladas suizas are basically enchiladas like we know of, filled with chicken and topped with cream, green sauce, and cheese. Au gratin, kind of. It's put in the oven. It's actually the Mexican version
of a crepe.
Of a crepe.
As you were describing, I'm like, of course, it's has
Is it served
tomatillos.
layered or is it wrapped?
It's wrapped like an enchilada, and they usually come nice in a nice little row. They're 3 nice in a little row, and they're absolutely delicious. And it is an iconic Mexico City dish. Iconic, iconic, iconic.
There's an argument that crepes came from Italy first with pastiche instead of crepes. So like they say that cuisine started in northern Italy and then the French adapted it. So let's get into it because now I'm really.
I mean, it could very well be because you can totally see the sort of layered concept, but you can start to see where the enchilada suiza is made with corn tortilla, which is very much corn found of the Americas, one of the, staples of the American continent's, diet. So you can see that Mexican indigenous element and influence, and then layered on top of that, literally.
Yes, literally.
Literally, that creamy sauce of very much like a bechamel of French culture and cuisine.
Oh, yes.
And so,
Interesting.
you can start to see how, again, cultures don't live in a vacuum, right? And people start to take those inspirations and use what is native to their communities and change the recipe, right? One last sort of food influence, right, from the French is something that is so iconic too, and my personal favorite sweetbread, which is an oreja. It's literally like the shape of an ear.
Yeah.
You might know
those.
them as French palmiers.
Yep.
They are literally inspired, taken from that sort of pastry tradition in France. And so you can start to see little by little in the sweet cuisine, in the savory cuisine, that ongoing French tradition that did not disappear just because the French lost the war. It just became part of the day-to-day life of Mexican communities, and then it transfers to Mexican-American communities here in the U.S.
So I'm going to have to say, I love having Emily here, but I don't know if we can have her come back anymore because every time she's on the show, I'm hungry as hell. Every time.
I know, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Well, I have a question because I think I've eaten those ear ones that you're saying because so wait, do you have that with coffee, right? You have that with coffee, right?
Yeah, you have it with coffee, with hot chocolate,
right? But you dip it in there, right? You dip it in there.
You can. I mean, a lot of times you'll have this tall café con leche, which is basically coffee with milk.
Yeah.
And you then take
It's almost like milk with coffee.
Exactly. But it's just so beautiful. And then you take your sweetbread. Sometimes it's the oreja. Sometimes it's like a concha, which is like a different type of sweetbread. And you dip it into the coffee with milk.
Yeah. I'll be honest with you, I had a very amazing friend that we went to Mexico City with the first time, and I didn't have to like really do anything. They're like, do you want to eat this? I'm like, yeah, I want to eat everything. So
eat it all.
So we did. We just ate everything.
I mean, it's the right thing to do.
It is.
There's never Mexico, never a bad time to say no to food. And I mean, I think one of the really interesting things here is then how we then start to see these traditions come from Mexico to the U.S. as Mexican-American communities grow and establish themselves here in the U.S. after the Mexican-American War in 1848. So we're back to wars. And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which basically gives the U.S. What we know of today as the American Southwest, right? California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, fill in the blank on those areas. Those communities that were living in those lands bring with them these traditions, bring with them these cultural and foodways traditions that we now see everywhere in the U.S., right? I mean, one of the really interesting facts to note is that, early in the 21st century or late 20th century, depending on, your frame of reference, salsa overtook ketchup as the number one condiment in America. And one of the reasons for that is that these communities, the Mexican-American community that is growing and expanding, really influences the cuisine that we eat today and we think of today as American food, right?
Yeah.
Tex-Mex, tacos, which brings us to Cinco de Mayo, right? And it's the full circle. And how do we get to Cinco de Mayo being popular in the U.S.?
Like a tortilla, just so you know. It's round.
It's
circular.
round. just like a tortilla.
I'm just staring at you because I just can't believe how much I don't know. I'm like, what the hell do
But
I know?
again, the good thing is, Emily says, we can go to the
it's
museums.
crazy.
That's what the Smithsonian's. We're fortunate to have them. They're a treasure,
and they're free.
just like Emily.
And they are free here
treasure.
in DC.
Thank you. So it comes back to Cinco de Mayo and how do we even have this celebration here in the U.S.? Why do we have it? Especially since it's not really celebrated outside of Puebla, how did it make its way to mainstream U.S. culture where, Cinco de Mayo is like second to the Super Bowl? The only day where avocado is most consumed in the U.S., second to the Super Bowl, is Cinco de Mayo.
Isn't that crazy? And it's like in January.
It's a really interesting phenomenon, right? We've taken these very iconic cultural elements, avocados native to Latin America, and we've made them into these major food icons for U.S. culture. Similar we've done to Cinco de Mayo. So how did it come to the U.S.? In the 1960s, there's this movement called the Chicano Movement, which is little bit of sort of backstory. Mexican-American communities can call themselves Mexican-Americans. They might call themselves Tejanos if they're from Texas. They might also call themselves Chicanos or Chicanas. And the Chicano movement really came to, a point, a head in the 1960s. And it was sort of parallel to the civil rights movement. And actually had a lot to do in part with the civil rights movement, with the farm workers movement. So you have some of these major 1960s social political movements. And the Chicano movement came of age in that time period. And the Chicano movement, one of the big things that they're trying to do in this movement is reclaim the indigenous past, the indigenous history, and recenter that, right? You might hear it today as decolonize, but it's really about reclaiming the indigenous past, the indigenous history. And so the Chicano movement looked to Cinco de Mayo as an example of indigenous people of Mexico, the community of Mexico, Mexican people coming together to basically beat the French, but expel the European invader, right? And so this idea of triumph of the indigenous people of the community that is from that area against the European settler. And that ideal was a very interesting ideal for the Chicano movement because it paralleled this idea that the Chicano movement had of reclaiming indigeneity, reclaiming its indigenous legacy and its past, and really centering the Chicano movement narrative in the rights of the people of the communities that were present, right? The historical communities.
Gina, Emily, it's really interesting because when you talk about these things, most of our listeners know my father is Mexican. Was, because I always say that, I always clarify because he's passed. But my mother had blonde hair and blue eyes and grew up Midwest, and no Mendoza speaks Spanish because my grandparents came to the U.S. 100 years ago and bought a farm in Duluth, Minnesota, or South Dakota really, and then ended up in Duluth, Minnesota. This whole Chicano movement you talk about is such a blank in my family history because my father was so much older, I think, and when my grandparents came into the U.S., it was about assimilation. And whether we agree with that now, it doesn't fit with our sensibilities today, and I find myself often apologizing for it. Because people are like, well, how many times, Gina, do you hear people say to me, you should be able to speak Spanish?
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, does everyone pop out bilingual? Because I did not. I missed that card. But it was growing up in the Midwest, it was about my fathers, the Mendozas were about assimilation, because for them that meant success. Mm-hmm. And then growing up in the Midwest, I was one of 2 Mexican families in the entire white neighborhood I grew up in. So it's just really, and when you say these things, that makes me want to go to what I'm getting at is that I obviously have a big, giant hole in my knowledge and even in my connection with my own heritage. And I guess what I'm getting is that I'm really can't wait to go to the museum to learn more about myself.
Well, I mean, like you, many. I think one of the things that, immigrant communities, whether you're Latino or Irish or Italian, I think immigrant communities struggle with this idea of retaining their heritage versus assimilating to the new community that they are part of, right? And I think that's a narrative that you see in history, but it's also a narrative you see today, right? And I think one of the really interesting things about history and the ability to go back in time and learn from it is to see, where did we come from, right? You know, there's the old saying of, you can't know where you're going until you know where you came from.
Yeah.
And I think there's this opportunity to learn, because so many of our ancestors really were trying to make it, right? They were trying to make it in the country. They were trying to make it in their new home. And in order to do that, they felt pressured to conform to where they were living, right? And to let go of some of those very obvious things that connect you to your heritage, like language, right? I think everybody, whether you know Spanish or not, everybody that has, Latino heritage can point to one thing, right? There may not be language, there may not be, your entire family history, but you may remember your grandmother, having a pan dulce, or you may remember, in your grandmother's home or your great grandmother's home having tortillas instead of bread, or, there are small elements that remain, right? But there is this larger push and larger effort to make sure that in order for your family to succeed, you must sacrifice that heritage background in order to conform to where you're living, right? And I think the reality is, kids today grow up with a much greater sense of the importance of heritage than maybe 20, 30 years ago.
Absolutely. I totally agree. But I think that's probably why I think that the museum, although it be late in the game to come to fruition, it's a pinnacle time for it to be a part of our American story.
I mean, it's never too late, number one. The educator in me wants to tell you that it's never too late to learn. But I also think, the museum, the National Museum of the American Latino, and its upcoming Molina Family Latino Gallery, as of later this spring, is going to tell the history of Latinos as part of U.S. history, right? So it's this idea that Latinos have been here and have been part of U.S. history, whether you acknowledge it or understand it or even know about it. And so I think this idea that you can go and see yourself and your story, whether you're Latino or non-Latino, is really important to telling the story of Latinos in this country, right? Because it helps you understand yourself, if you are Latino, or your neighbor or your friend or your teacher or your fireman,
or your
non-Latino.
Or your podcast co-host.
Or your podcast co-host, exactly. I mean, I think the reality is it helps you understand that human story, right? And there are a lot of elements in the history of Latinos that are also elements in the history of other communities and cultures, right? And I think we want to isolate history into one particular group of people. But the reality is that they're human stories, right? The story of immigration, the story of war, the story of, economic empowerment, the story of food and foodways traditions. These are human stories, right? We're telling them in the museum from the Latino lens. But in theory, anybody walking through those doors should be able to connect with that story, because you should be able to see your own story in that. Whether or not you're Latino. And I think that's the beauty of the museum, the gallery, our resources online, is that hopefully it helps demystify Cinco de Mayo, but it also helps say, oh my gosh, there's so many connections here, right, that I didn't see before, and that now I see, and it totally makes sense why there's French architecture in Mexico, right? And it's like, oh, aha.
Wait, Gina, I think this should inspire you to make a cocktail.
We need a drink.
All right, let's get a drink.
Because, it's the only way I'm going to forget the fact that, we've invested so much in the Cinco de Mayo.
All right, let's get a drink.
Okay. All right, so this is one of my favorite fun classic cocktails. This is a version of The Last Word, right? So we're going to add mezcal, which is one of my favorite agave-based spirits. And a little trick to this when you're thinking about tequila versus mezcal is tequila can only come from the state of Jalisco. So just remember that when you're kind of going to the store and you're like, oh, I'm going to buy tequila. Did it come from Jalisco? then it is tequila. Did it come from somewhere else, an agave-based spirit? Then it is mezcal. So just remember that when you're talking about it. All right. So I love the last word because it is a bunch of ingredients that don't make any sense and they should not go together. And it is Luxardo, chartreuse, and today we're going to use the mezcal and lime. Traditionally, it's made with gin. Also doesn't seem to go together. And what's fun about this drink, it's from the Detroit Athletic Club in Detroit. It's an old classic cocktail. And now we're gonna make it a little bit new and a little bit more fun, okay? And we'll adopt it for, what did we say? It is the Pueblo Independent.
Battle of Puebla.
Battle of Puebla. I'm no longer calling it Cinco de Mayo. All right, so here we go. So the deal is that if you're making this for you and your friend, it's 3/4 ounce for each individual cocktail. I'm gonna do 1.5 ounces because I'm making 2 drinks here. Just remember, it's equal parts. So if you're making, gallons of it, then it's a gallon, and a gallon. So right now we're gonna do 1.5 ounces of each thing. So we put in the maraschino liqueur, we put in our mezcal, and now we're gonna add our chartreuse. Chartreuse is a little fun liquor that was developed in the 1700s in France, so it kind of makes sense that it's all together in France. And it's just 130 ingredients and no one knows what's in it, so that's what's kind of the beauty of that liquor. All right, so then we're gonna do that, and we're gonna put in juice of a whole lime. And again, it's a 3/4 ounce for each drink. So for us, 1.5 ounces is about what comes out of a fresh lime. So, right, everything so far sounds pretty disgusting. Some kind of herbaceous liquor, something that tastes like cherry, and then you have this, wonderful agave spirit, and we're gonna put it in there. You're gonna fill the top of your shaker tin 3/4 full of ice. Combine the two, 90 degrees on your elbow, and you're gonna shake. And just when you think it's done, it's not done because your hands can still hold it, so it is not ready.
It's such a beautiful sound, is it not, Emily?
It is great.
Yeah, it makes me like salivate.
So when you can look at your tin and you can write your name on it is when you know it's finished, right? So I'm gonna give it a little love tap. Take that off. Now we chilled our glasses. Now traditionally you'd put this in a coupe, but today we're gonna do this in, you can put it in any glass. As long as you chill it, it's fine. Just make sure that your glass has a bottom and the drink doesn't fall out, okay? So we're gonna strain this in. Now, your drink has an option. You can put on there, excuse me, the drink is optional garnish. You can use cherry or you can opt out, and I will, ladies, cherries, no cherries?
No cherry.
Please.
No? Okay, it's a little bit sweeter with the cherry.
I'm good.
There we go. So this is a brandy cherry that we're gonna use, and you put one in the bottom. Last chance.
Okay, I'll try the cherry. I'll try something new.
You don't have to eat it. It's just this last touch of sweetness. Otherwise, it becomes sometimes a little tart, but who cares? It's still delicious.
Kind of like Gina, just a little tart.
And that's it. And this is your Mezcal Last.
Thank you.
Oh, wow, this looks beautiful.
Yes, cheers.
It's delicious, I promise.
Cheers.
Oh, that's beautiful on the nose.
This is very nice. Very smooth.
Well, I bet you that's a little bit uncanny that they all go together, huh?
It is. And I think it speaks to everything that Emily has been talking about. I think you did an amazing job. What do you think, Emily? This cocktail's amazing.
It has French.
Yes.
It has Mexico. And you know what? Most importantly.
And Italy.
It has French, it has Mexico, it has Italy. But most importantly, it's tasty.
Yes.
Oh, I love that. We'll make it part of your repertoire making a Mezcal Last Word.
There you go.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
So where are they going to go to get this?
You're going to go to designateddrinker.show for our tips, tricks, how-tos, why you should not be eating tortilla chips on Cinco de Mayo.
You can still eat tortilla chips and guacamole and drink tequila and mezcal.
Absolutely.
I mean, basically, now you can be an informed designated drinker.
There you go. On Cinco de Mayo.
I got my new bar thing where I'm going to be like, so what do you think Cinco de Mayo is about?
Yeah.
And then I'm going to make you wrong and then have bets.
That's
All right,
at the
Emily,
bar.
I'm gonna have Emily come to the bar and be like, all right, here we go. You. What do you think it is? Wrong. What is the right answer? And then I'm gonna say,
Sign me up.
And
I'll do
every
that.
time they get a wrong answer, Emily gets a drink.
Yeah.
Oh my God, she's gonna be on the floor in minutes.
But I will be having a blast because I think you should still celebrate Cinco de Mayo, but now you can celebrate it and know the truth and the history behind it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. But no, that drink is amazing. Thank you. It's a different take.
Yeah.
We're going to make sure that we have everything for the museum at designateddrinker.show, along with the tips and tricks and how-tos, as we always do, but make sure that people have access when even those who don't live in the DC area have ways to learn more and maybe fill those gaps like me.
Exactly. And if you ever do find yourself in DC, come visit us at the Smithsonian. We're your nation's museum, and we're free and open 364 days a year.
Yay!
So I don't know. Did we ask you last time this question? I don't think so.
Well, let's see if it's the same answer.
Oh, yeah. Maybe it's
we did. I'm
changed,
sure
right?
we did. I'm sure we
Well,
did.
she's looking at me, so I guess we have not.
No, I think we have.
So in this day and age, everyone identifies themselves with mythical beings. And maybe you identify with the chupacabra. And you're like, I'm going to come in and decimate you. No, I'm just kidding. If you can identify yourself with one ingredient, whether it's for food or beverage, what would that ingredient be and why does it define you?
Man, this is hard.
We didn't ask her.
I don't know.
You did not ask me.
How did we miss that?
It was a Christmas
holiday
episode.
Oh, man.
First thing that comes to your mind.
Cheese.
Yes. Why? Go. First thing.
It's ooey gooey and soft. And I tend to be a softie.
I love it.
I think that's why I like education, because I'm a softie at heart.
Aww.
And the ooey gooey of cheese reminds me of being a softie.
Oh my gosh, I love that answer.
And it goes perfect on bread.
And it goes perfect on bread. Honestly, it goes perfect on
everything.
anything.
Put cheese on everything.
I love that.
All right, cheers.
Cheers. Thank
Cheers,
you.
thank
Cheers.
you.
The Designated Drinker Show is produced by Missing Link, a podcast media company that is dedicated to connecting people to intelligent, engaging, and informative content. Also in the Missing Link lineup of podcasts is Roger That, a podcast dedicated to guiding you through the haze of dementia, led by skilled caregivers Bobby and Mike Carducci. Now, if you're looking for a whole new way to enjoy the theater, check out Between Acts, an immersive audio theater podcast experience. Each episode takes you on a spellbinding journey through the works of newfound playwrights, from dramas to comedies and everything in between. Find Missing Link's League of Podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Please don't forget to subscribe, download, and review the shows. Your review helps our shows reach new audiences. To find out more about Missing Link, visit missinglink.company. That's missinglink.company.